All right, Shabbos, good morning, a good tevach. We are beginning in Eretz Hashem, a brand new, beautiful week of Limud together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. Sorry, just had it before. To thank Stephen Terry Zinn for dedicating all of his Shuman Drushos this month in loving memory of Terry's father, Dr. Harry Khan Hirsch, Ben Yosef HaKohen. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah ben Zechariah and Dina Bas Dov. To thank our week of learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsor of the Eloi Nishmas, Moshe Aaron Alter Ben Yosef Binyamin on the occasion of his first yard site, and Eloi Nishmas Sarah Dina Bas Ali Melech. We hope to honor the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Lav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Lamed Dalet 34. Does this sound okay? Microphone? Yeah, good. No, good. Good. So I'll say 34. We are picking up a Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah on Lamed Dalid Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says as follows: similar to the previous cases that we had before, Ra as Hakoy. Person sees a kai. Now, both say we've spoken about kai before, specifically those who were with us for the last cycle in Maseches Chulin. We spoke a lot about a kai because a kai is an animal where there is a machlokes if it is a behema or a chaya. Now, you might ask yourself, what does that matter? So remember, again, the major distinction is for the mitzvah of kisoy hadam. Whether or not after shchita there is an obligation to go ahead and cover the blood of the animal. For a behema, there is no din of kisoy hadam. For a chaya, there is a din of kisoy hadam. There are other ramifications as well, but the Mishnah says as follows: Ra esakai. So here is the case. A person goes ahead and a person sees a kai, and goes ahead and he says, Amar Harini Nazir. Person says, I'm a Nazir. Right? Harini Nazir shezeh chaya. I'm a Nazir that this kai is considered to be a chaya. Harini, that's guy number one. Guy number two, Harini Nazir shezeh eino chaya. Guy number two says, I'll be a Nazir that it's not a chaya. Guy number three, Harini Nazir shezeh behema. I'm a Nazir that it's a behema. Guy number four, Harini Nazir she'ein zeh behema. I'm a Nazir that's not a behema. Guy number five, Harini Nazir shezeh chaya u behema. Right? I'm Nazir in the condition that it's a chaya and a behema. Number six, Harini Nazir she'ein zeh lo chaya v'lo behema. Right? I'm gonna be a Nazir in the condition that it's not a chaya, not a behema. That's a Harini Nazir she'echad mikem Nazir. I'll be a Nazir that one of you guys before me is a Nazir. Last guy, Harini Nazir she'ein echad mikem Nazir. I'll be a Nazir if none of you guys are Nazir. Last guy, Harini Nazir shekulchem Nazirim. I'll be a Nazir if all of you are Nazir. I'll say, so what is the halacha? What is the status of all these individuals? Kulan Nazirim. They're all considered to be Nazirim. So halacha, so all considered to be Nazirim. Now I will say, now interestingly enough, if you look at the Rush, so okay, Moshe pointed out to me that my Rush pagination may not be the same as other people's Rush pagination, although why did no one tell me this for the first 34 blot of the Masechta? Sitting here like an idiot saying, look at 4 lines, all right, whatever. So I'm not sure exactly what to do about that, but at least in my pagination of the Rush, if you look 6 lines up from before the Rush gets wide, in the left-hand margin of the Rush, so the Rush asks a simple question. I will say, when you look at this Mishnah, what's the point of the Mishnah? The Mishnah seems to be saying it's the same machlokes Hashem Beis Hillel that we had before, which seems to be a general machlokes of hektish bitos, havi hektish, Allah havi hektish. So we already discussed the idea. Beis Shammai holds that hektish bitos, have hektish. So that seems to be what this Mishnah is saying. So it's a little bit anticlimactic for us because we already pointed out that halacha l'maisa, we do not paskin that way, right? But we paskin that hektish betaos lo havi hektish. Although again we spoke about the beautiful Lublina Rav that hashkafa l'maisa we paskin hektish betaos havi hektish. But again, the Rush asks over here, I don't understand. What is this Mishnah coming to teach me? He says ve'im tomar ech baltana listam ki Beis Shammai. Is the Tana just coming to quote another case according to Beis Shammai? To the Beis Hillel, mi she'eno kidvarav lo havi nazir. You must remember again, according to Beis Hillel, the only people in this Mishnah who will become a Nazir are the people whose statements are true. But anyone whose statement turns out to be untrue is not going to be a Nazir. Because remember again, Beis Hillel holds hekdish betos lo have hekdish. So what's going on over here? He's to be shlomar ashmoina namid la Beis Hillel the safek Nazir havi the kai have safek chaya safek behema the safek beria umachmirim be chumra shnehem va'asu ba'avra. Supposed to listen to this. According to the Rush, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even Beis Hillel would agree with the conclusion. Remember again, the Mishnah ends off by saying all of these guys in Mishnah, they're all Nazirim. They're all Nazirim. So according to Beis Shammai, I understand that why, because hekdish b'ta'os have hekdish. But according to the Rosh Chiddush of the Mishnah, even according to Beis Hillel, they are all going to be Nazirim. They're all Nazirim. Why? Because Rabbi say a kai is a suffix. We're not sure what to do with a kai. There are three possibilities when it comes to a kai. Either it's a behema, either it's a chaya, or possibility number three, which is it's a birya bifnei atzma. It's its own independent entity. So Beis Hillel says when people make these statements in the Mishnah, it's not clear who's correct. Safek Naziros is going to go l'chumra, says Beis Hillel. Therefore, again, he agrees with the bottom line conclusion, which all nine of these guys are going to be Nazirim. All these guys are going to be Nazirim. Okay, so that's according to the Rush, the entire Chiddush of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Tani Chada, Tisha Nazirim. So we'll say, interesting enough, there are two brises. In one brise it says, that's what I was hearing the echo. Okay, I thought it was the thing, it was this. Sorry. So Tani Chada, Tisha Nazirim. So ultimately, I will say, so one brisa says that when you look at the case in this Mishnah, there are 9 Nazirim. The Tanya Idach, Teisha Nazirios. Another version of the brisa says, when looking at the case of this Mishnah, there are 9 durations or 9 terms of Naziros. What does the Rabbi say? That the second version of the brisa says one guy is going to be a Nazir for 9 consecutive terms. Says the Gemara, Bishlama Tisha Nazirin, Kigon Dahavi Gavri Tvei, De'itbis Va'azilbei. So I say you could easily go ahead and make this into a case of 9 Nazirim. How do you make it into a case of 9 Nazirim? Just add on more guys to the list. That's not a big deal. If you look at the Rush, again, the Rush says, second wide line, Aval test Naziros lechad. I'm sorry. The first wide line of the Rush. Bishlam test Nazirin kigon dahavi gabri tuva ki deparshu asnisin. I was supposed to say, to tell me that there's a case of 9 Nazirim, in other words, 9 people who all become Nazirim. Okay, that's the case of the Mishnah. That's obvious, right? In other words, guy number 1 says A, guy number 2 says B, guy number C, so on and so forth. And again, according to Beis Shammai, they're all going to be Nazirim because Hekdish Betaos have a Hekdish. According to Beis Hillel, in this case, they're all going to be Nazirim, ultimately because the Kai is a Safek Naziris is going to go to Chumrah. But asks the Gemara, Elatation Nazirios Lechad Gavra Hechi Mishkachosla. But I was saying, how can you have a situation of one guy having 9 consecutive durations or terms of Naziros? To which the Gemara says, Bishlama Shis Mashkachas La Kidisnan. So we'll say 6 could work, because 6 is the case in the Mishnah. Right? 6 is the case in the Mishnah. Take a look at the Rush again. Aval tes Naziros Chad Gavrech Mishkachas, Bishlama Shis, right? Mishkachas La Kigon Sha'amar Adam Echad Mehesha Amru. Hashisha sheze chaya, she'eno chaya, sheze behema, she'eno behema, shul chaya ubehema, she'eno chaya ubehema. Shabbos says, so now listen to this. You could come up with 6. Why come up with the 6? Because there are 6 different formulations in the Mishnah. So you could go ahead and have one guy make all 6 statements. So if one guy makes all 6 statements, Shabbos say, what has he effectively done? What has he done? He's taken on 6 durations of Naziros. But says the Gemara, Aval Tlas, back to the Gemara, Aval Tlas, Heichi Mishkachasla. Where do the last 3 come from? To which the Gemara says, Amar Sheshes Kigom da Amar, Harini Nazir, Unaziros Hakol Alai. So I will say, okay, it's actually a pretty simple answer. What does he do? He goes ahead and he says, I am a Nazir, and all of the Naziros is upon me. Now look at the Rush again. He says, Di'im tes shetfisu kidiparshu asnisin va'amru echad kol din Nazir shal kol chamalai nimtzala Beis Shammai tes Nazir. So also listen to this. So what you could have is Remember, you could make the Mishnah into 9 different articulations. So essentially, if a guy says, Hareini Nazir, I'm a Nazir, Uniziras Akalalai, and the Nazirus of all those other people is upon me. So essentially, what is he doing in that case? He's taking upon himself what? The Nidre Nazirus vowed by each of those other individuals. Again, when you put that all together, you get 9. Therefore, it become a Nazir ultimately again for 9 terms of Nazirus. Incredible. Shabbos say, I'll just point out over here, the Rambam codifies this case in Parak Beis Halacha Yud. And the Rambam writes as follows. He says, now remember, the Rambam Paskins like Beis Hillel, which means what? Hekdish bitaos lo have hekdish. So therefore, again, I will say, whenever you make an Neder Naziros, and your Neder Naziros that is based on a mistaken premise, you are not a Nazir, right? So if we go back to the paradigmatic case that we saw in yesterday's Mishnah, right? Because that was really the case we've been talking this entire time, right? There's a group of guys walking. They see someone walking towards them. What happens? The first guy says, I'm a Nazir, if that's Ruvain. Second guy says, I'm a Nazir, if that's not Ruvain, right? So in that case, I will say, the way we paskin halacha lemaisa is the guy who's right is going to be a Nazir. The guy who's wrong, what? Is not a Nazir. I will say, by the way, I'll also point out to you something amazing. The concept of hekdish b'taos lo have hekdish, I will say, also teaches you a profound yesod, which is, in life, there's right and there's wrong. You know, we live in a society where there's a tremendous infusion of moral equivalency, right? In other words, that we are not allowed to tell anyone that they're wrong, right? Everyone is right. There's just different versions of right, right? And if you feel it, if you this, and what it does is, besides for the moral decay, what it just does is, if there's no objective right or wrong in life, then how does society as a whole find a way to move forward? Then what's the barometer? And you see it. You see it happening today. So it's such an incredible yesod. You know, both say. So can you imagine, like, if you were to put this case to the societal metric, right? So there's a group of people walking around, right? And there's a guy walking towards them. And the first guy says, I'm a Nazir if it is Ruvain. Second guy says, I'm a Nazir if it's not Ruvain. So, you know, like societally, we say, well, you're both right, right? Because, I don't know, maybe the guy walking towards you, he says he's a Ruvain, right? He feels like a Ruvain, right? So he's got, in other words, so I'll say, so it's just, when we interact with people, we have to interact with people, all people with derech eretz. That's not, but a society has to have an intact moral fabric that says certain things are right, certain things are wrong, certain things are tameh, certain things are tahar. Because if you don't have that, then any form of life clarity is absolutely obscured. It's such. So no, you're right, you're wrong. That's it. No, but I want to be right also. I understand you want to be right, but you're wrong. But you're wrong. Just because you want to be right, just because you feel you should be right, does not mean you're right. Anyway, so the Rambam Paskins, in this case, I will say over here, so we pass like Beis Shammai, like Beis Hillel, hektish betaos lo have hektish. Now, interestingly enough, in the Kai case, the Rambam Paskins like the Mishnah, right? The Rambam Paskins like the Mishnah, namely, all of these guys are Nazirim. But how does that stem? Because we just said before, the Rambam Paskins like Beis Hillel, that hekdish betaos lo have hekdish. So why in this case, why this should be a case of hekdish betaos? So we'll say the Rambam writes, very simple, mipnei. So the truth is, we'll say the Rambam has it over here as kvi instead of kai. There are different pronunciations of the word. He has it as kvi. Mipnei shakai yesh bo drachim shava b'hen lechaya, v'yesh bo drachim shava b'hen lebehema, v'yesh bo drachim shava lechaya ulebehema. And therefore, going to both say, essentially what the Rambam says is what? Is that it's a suffix case. So remember, that's why, as the Rush said already, that's why the Rush was a lead up to this. This is a case of suffix. So I will say, in the previous case, there's no suffix. Why is there no suffix? Either it's Ruvain or it's not Ruvain, right? There's no suffix. In this case, with the Kai, it's an actual suffix. So therefore, even Beis Hillel would agree that halacha l'maaseh everyone is a Nazir in this case, and that is how the Rambam will say. By the way, The Rambam brings down another case. Listen to this. Listen to this. What's another case like this? Listen to this. The Gemara doesn't quote this, but he says, V'hu adin imra'u androgynous. It's the same case, Rabbi said. Let's say a group of people are walking down the street, and they see a person approaching them. First person says, I'm a Nazir if that's a man. Second person says, I'm a Nazir if that's a woman. So we'll say, so we know in halacha androgynous, there's suffix considering, right? There's suffix relating to that individual. So the Rambam says, halacha l'maisa, what happens in that case? Kulam nazirim, right? Everyone is a Nazir. So just pointing out, interestingly enough, so again, we paskin hekdish betos lo have hekdish. That's what paskin like Beis Hillel. But in a case of what we'll call hekdish besafek, or a case of safek, even Beis Hillel will agree that safek nazirus lechumra, and therefore they're all going to be nazir. Incredible. I will say, if you want to look up that case, that's Hilchos Nazirus, Perek Beis Halacha Yud. Great case. And I will say, Hadrun Alach Beishamai, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Okay, next, I will say this is an exciting parak actually, because now we're going to begin to actually get into many of the details regarding the restrictions actually of Nazirus. So the Mishnah writes as follows: Shlosha minin asurim ben Nazir. There are three things that a Nazir is prohibited to. What are they? Hatuma, can't become tameh. Taglachos, can't take a haircut. V'hayotze min hagefen, and is prohibited to eat anything that comes from the grape. And I will say three basic restrictions, ultimately, again, of Nazirus. Beautiful. Says the Mishnah. V'chol hayotze min hagefen mitzarpin says, bless you. And I will say any part of the grape, right? So let for example, just for example purposes, although we're going to discuss this in just a moment in the Mishnah. So let's say halacha l'maisa, the shear for achila, for a grape, for a Nazir is going to be a kizayis. It's going to be a kizayis, right? So what we're going to see is that halacha l'maisa, the different parts of the grape have the ability to combine, and ultimately form the requisite shear for prohibition. Ve'in chayav ad sheyochal min ha'anavim kizayis, but you're only chayiv if you eat a kizayis from the grape. So that's the sheer isra, we'll say. Amid Beis, Mishnah Rishona, Omeres, ad sheyishter revi'is yayin. So we'll say, we're going to talk about this statement in the Gemara, because it's actually quite interesting. Now, Mishnah Rishona, we'll say, means what? An earlier version of the halacha. So an earlier version of the halacha said that when it comes to liquid, right, when it comes to wine, the shear for drinking wine for a Nazir, ultimately, again, is going to be a revi'is. Now, watch this. He says, Rabbi Akiva says, Afilu shara pito bayayin, the yeshba kedei letzarif kezayis chayiv. So this is actually pretty incredible. Rabbi Akiva says that if you soak. If you soak your bread in wine, ultimately, again, so I will say, and it forms the shear of the kizayis chayiv. And I will say, now what's the chiddush over here? The chiddush over here is like this. What combines to form part of the kizayis? The bread. Even though what? The bread is absolutely mutter. So we'll say we are going to see that this is a concept in halacha of heter mitztaref le'isr, which is really very exciting, right? Very exciting. So in other words, we'll say, I take bread, I'm a Nazir, I take bread, I dip it in wine. I now eat a kizayis of bread. What's the halacha? I'm in violation of my Nazirus. But one second, the majority, it's quite possible the majority of what I ate was what? Was actual heter, was bread. Nothing wrong with bread. Right? So therefore, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Akiva says the chiddush over here is the bread combines with the wine to form the requisite shear of kizayis. Incredible. The chayiv al yain bifnei atzmo, v'al ha'anavim bifnei atzmon, v'al ha'chartzonin bifnei atzmon, v'al ha'zogin bifnei atzmon. Okay, so I'll say, so now here we go. Furthermore, says the Gemara, when it comes, so the Mishnah said before that you're chayiv for gefen and kol yotzim and a gefen, anything comes from grapes. So we'll say, what does that include? So number one, it includes wine, right? Grapes, anavim are grapes. Chartzon, and I will say we're going to have machlokes on these terms, but for now, let's define chartzonim as grape skins, right? Zogin as grape seeds. So in other words, you're chayiv for consumption for any part of the grape. So either the wine that comes from the grape, the actual full grape itself, grape skins, or grape seeds. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Ein chayiv ad sheyochal shnei chartzonim v'zog. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says you're only chayiv, we'll say, if you eat 2 grape skins and a seed. That's the shear. Again, we'll discuss the technicalities of all of this. But actually, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is actually basing himself on the pasuk, which we'll discuss. Right? So you have to eat 2 grape skins and a seed. So Elohein chartson and the Elohein zagin. So we'll say, what are the chartson and what are the zagin? Ha chartsonim elu achitzonium. So I will say chartsonim we are now defining as grape skins. Zogim elu apnimium. This refers to the grape seeds. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds chartsonim, grape seeds. Zogin, grape seed. I'm sorry. Chartsonim, grape skins. Zogim, grape seeds. Rabbi Yossi says he disagrees. He says, Shalotita, Rabbi Yehuda, I think you're wrong. And let me tell you the way to remember what is what. Kizug shel behema. Think about it as a cowbell, right? The bell of an animal. Hachitzon zug v'apinimi inbal. The external part of the bell is called the zug, and the clapper of the bell is called the inbal. So we'll say, now listen to this. So therefore, again, just the machlokes in terms. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda holds that chartsonim are grape skins, zogim are grape seeds. Rabbi Yossi holds zogim are grape skins and chartsonim are grape seeds. Okay, so just the machlokes in terms. Beautiful. Rabbi let's analyze. Says the Gemara. Here we go. Shlosha mina masurim ben Nazir hatuma. So now here's what's interesting. So remember, the Mishnah introduced us to this idea that Allah Lamaisa, if you are a Nazir, 3 things are prohibited. Number 1, taglachas, or I should say, number 1, tuma, right, becoming impure. Number 2, taglachas, haircutting. Number 3, the lashon of the Mishnah was yotze min hagefen, that which comes from the grape. Now remember, just to keep the flow of the Mishnah in mind, the Mishnah then defined what's the definition of that which comes from the grape. Sounds like 4 parts, right? Part one, the grape. Part 2, grape skins. Part 3, grape seeds. And part 4, wine. Wine, that's what it sounds like. Says the Gemara. Here we go. Hayotzi min gefen in, gefen atzmolo. Ooh, interesting. So I will say, the lashon of the Mishnah is, a Nazir is liable for eating that which comes from the grape. So it sounds like any grape or grape derivatives. Those are the 4 things we just mentioned. What about eating the shoots of the vine itself? Well, say, take a look at the Rush. I'm assuming this is the second line of the Rush for all of us, right? So Rush, right-hand column, gefen atzmolo kigon olin v'lulavin. So I will say, what happens if you eat the leaves or the soft shoots? See, the Gemara is taking into account actually eating the hardened vines, because bepashtos, that's not edible. But what about the consumption of the soft leaves or the soft shoots? So I will say, interestingly enough, that comes from the vine, right? That's the vine, but it's not what? It's not what? It's not a grape derivative, right? It's not yotze min hagefen. So the Gemara says the fact that the Mishnah frames the prohibition of the Nazir as referring to that which comes from the grape, which seemed to indicate to us that the consumption of the leaves or the soft shoots you would not be liable for that. I was going to gefen asmolo. So we'll say maslisin de lo Rabbi Elazar. Our Mishnah is not reflective of Rabbi Elazar. Why not? So listen to this. So we'll say the sign Rabbi Elazar Omer afilu alin v'lulavin b'mashma. Because we'll say Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that we'll say not only are you chayiv for gefen and yotze min hagefen, not only are you chayiv for grape derivatives, those 4 things, but lamaisa, you're also chayiv for what? The shoots and the leaves of the vine. Very interesting. Can't even eat the shoots and the leaves of the vine, according to Rabbi Elazar. So the Gemara says, Ikeda Amri, others say, Ikeda Amri la seifa, Eino chayiv achiocha min ha'anavim kizayis. So we'll say, others frame this question on the seifa. What do the seifa say? You're not chayiv for violation of your neder nezirus until you go ahead and you eat the kizayis from grapes. Min ha'anavim in, so I will say, it sounds like from grapes, yes. Min hagefen atzmolo, but from the vines themselves, no. So, once again, Masisin de lo Rabbi Elazar. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Elazar. The sign of Rabbi Elazar, Omer afilu olin v'lulavin b'mashma. So I will say, so this is item number 1, right? So item number 1, halacha l'maisa is first machlokes. Mishnah introduces us to the idea that Nazir is chayiv for anything yotze min hagefen. What's included again in yotze min hagefen? We'll call it whole grape, grape skins, grape seeds, wine. right? So now the Gemara says the inference from that is not like Rabbi Lazar, right? Rabbi Lazar holds you chayiv even for eating leaves and soft shoots, soft leaves, soft shoots. So Rabbi say, so clearly again the Mishnah is rejecting that view. So Rabbi say, what we are left with now is a fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanon. There is a Nazir allowed to eat the leaves and the shoots from a vine or not? Rabbanon, yes. Rabbi Lazar, no. Rabbi say, here we go. This is going to be the rest of the Amud. But my kameflagi. So Rabbi say, what is at the root of this machlokes, Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanon? Here we go. So Rabbi say, this is great. Rabbi Lazar darshi ribui umiute, Rabbanon darshi klali uprati. So Rabbi say, we're going to see now, we actually haven't had this in a little while, a real good old-fashioned exegetical machlokes, right? What a way to start the week. So Rabbi say, so what their machlokes is, how to darshan the pasuk. Remember again, Rabbi say, we've seen many times throughout our journeys in Shas, there's a ribui and a miot and a klal uprat. Now, interestingly enough, there's a lot of similarities between them as we're going to see, right? A ribui is an expansive or an inclusive phrase. A miot is a limiting one. Klal is a general statement. Prat is a specific statement. But we're going to see that the way you darshan a ribui and a miot and a klal or prat, we know this, are fundamentally different from each other, and as such, they yield different halachic results. Now, remember, I'm going to both say they are both legitimate exegetical principles, right? Remember again, we say this every single day in Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Shlosh Esrei Midos HaTorah Nidreshas Bohen. There are different. So again, each of these opinions we're going to see. The Rabbanon and Rabbi Lazar had a different Masorah, had a different tradition from their Rebbeim about how to darshan these respective psukim. So here we go. So the Gemara says like this. Let's analyze. So Rabbi Lazar darshan miuti, Rabbanon darshan klal prati. First, start with Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar darshan ribui miuti. So Rabbi Lazar darshans a ribui, which remember again is an inclusive phrase, and a miut, a limiting phrase. So here we go. Pasuk says, "Miyayin v'sheichar yazir." So we'll say by the Nazir, the Torah says, from wine and sheichar, right? From wine, remember again, normally wine, right? Yayin is aged wine, sheichar is newer wine. We're going to discuss these terms, but again, don't think that sheichar means like beer, right? Sheichar in this context means wine. Means wine, just different types of wine. So the Nazir can't drink wine. So miyayin sheichar, miet. Rabbi say, right? That is a limiting phrase. That's a limiting phrase. Mikol asher ya'aseh migefan hayayin. But then the pasuk says he's not allowed to have anything that is produced from the vine, right? Riba, that is a more inclusive phrase. So we'll say, now what do you have? Mi'et v'riba. So we'll say in general, when you have a miut and then a ribui, riba hakol, it comes to include everything. Now what are you coming to? Now when we say include everything, by the way, in this context, it means include everything under the umbrella of prohibition. So what's being included? So riba called my riba. Rabbi say what's being included? Riba kol mili. It comes to include everything. Everything means what Rabbi is saying. Bepashos, everything means everything that comes from the vine, including what? Shoots and leaves. Right? My mi'et. Rabbi say ultimately again, what is it coming to exclude? Mi'et shabishta. Rabbi say what is it coming to exclude? Now, the Rush over here says Shabishta means Zmuros. Means Rabbi say the actual vines themselves. In other words, the hardened vines, which everyone will agree are what? Are not edible. So Rabbi say, so this is the drush of Rabbi Eliezer. It's very simple. It's a miut and a ribui. Ultimately, whenever you have a miut and a ribui, riba hakol, what does it come to include? Anything edible that comes from the vine. So that's all four parts of the grape, or all four components of the grape. Right? Remember, grapes, grape skins, grape seeds, wine, and the ribui comes to teach you that what? Even the leaves and the shoots. What does it come to exclude? Exclude the vine itself, the hardened vine itself. For Rabbanan darshi, klali uprati. The Rabbanan darshan, on the other hand, klalu prat. Here we go. Miyayin v'sheichar yazir prat. Pasuk says he can't drink wine and sheichar. That's a prat, right? They both say, right? That is a specific. Mikol asher ya'aseh migefan hayayin. But then the pasuk says, from anything that is made from the vine, klal. That's an inclusive, right? That's a general statement. Mecharsonim va'ad zag. But both say, then it says, let's define from grape skins to grape seeds. So what happened? Chazar uprat. We'll say that's another limiting. That's another specific statement. So what do you have over here? Prat uklal uprat. So we'll say, what do you do when you have a prat uklal uprat? Ein atodon ela ke'ein haprat. So we'll say the exegetical rule is that when you have a klal uprat uklal, ultimately again, so we'll say, so everything is seen through the lens of the prat. Ma prat mefurash pri upsoles pri. So we'll say, just like the prat, right? In this case over here is a fruit. And I will say the term psoles pri is interesting. Psoles here will say means psoles literally means what? Right? The psoles means like the garbage, right? The inferior stuff. We're going to see what it means. So just like the prat refers to the pri and the inferior part of the pri, af kol pri upsoles pri. I will say, by the way, we're going to see what's the psoles of grapes? Vinegar. So we are going to see, I will say that a Nazir, interesting enough, what Rabbanan are going to learn out from their klal, uprat to klal, is an interesting, I should say, I'm sorry, it's actually not, I'm sorry, just the opposite. It's a prat, uklal, uprat. What they are going to learn ultimately is it's a grape and any grape derivative. And the chiddush is even that which is the psoles of the grape, even that which is the inferior output of the grape, which is going to be vinegar, a Nazir is not permitted to partake of as well. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, "Ima prat mafura." So therefore, here it is. The fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanon about whether or not a Nazir is permitted to go ahead and eat the leaves and the soft shoots of a vine is dependent on how you darshan these psukim. Rabbi Lazar is darshaning it ultimately again as a riboy and a miut, and therefore, from his conclusion, the riboy and miut tells us that Allah Kalamaisa Nazir is not allowed to eat. A Nazir is not allowed to eat the leaves and the shoots. Again, what is he technically allowed to eat? For what is there no prohibition? The actual vines themselves, the hardened vines, which they're not edible. The Rabbanan darshan prat uklal uprat, and therefore their conclusion is a Nazir is allowed to eat the leaves and the shoots. What can't he eat? Any type of grape or grape derivative, including vinegar. Good. Says the Gemara, but 1 second, asking the Rabbanon, Ima prat mafurash pri gomer, af kol pri gomer. But 1 second, why don't you according to the Rabbanon, just like the prat refers to a fully finished grape, fully finished pri. Maybe ultimately, again, the prohibition should only be on a fully finished pri. Im kain maniach locha kasa mashmao shelo amru. So we'll say, if that's the case, we'll say, the whole chap of these exegetical principles is to do what? Is to learn out additional items more than that's written in the pasuk, right? And that's the whole point of these exegetical principles. You apply them, and it provides you with additional new information. So we'll say, if that's the case, that all we're coming to include is a pre-gummer, then ultimately, again, what more is to be learned that wasn't already stated in the pasuk? Rather says the Gemara, because remember again, fresh grapes, dried grapes are already included. To which the Gemara says, Yayin v'chometz haksivi, wine and vinegar already written. Ha'ein alecha lodun kilashon acharon ela kilashon rishon. Rather, I will say it must be that halacha l'maisa, we can't darshan like the last lashon, but rather we have to go ahead and darshan like the first lashon of the prat, namely that the prat ultimately again is not necessarily pre-gomer, a finished pre, rather a pre-stam, just a regular pre. So the Gemara says, called davar. If at the end they were going to include everything, so ma Talmud lomar mechar tsanim va'adzag. So then why does the pasuk need to say the phrase from the grape skins to the grape seeds? Lomar lecha, to teach us, or we'll say what? Komakom sha'ata motze prat uklal. Wherever you find a bosai, the concept of a prat and a klal, namely a specific and then a general statement. You cannot darshan everything through the lens of the prat. Ella naase klal mosaf ala prat. Rather, I will say what's happening over here is the klal itself is coming to add on to the prat. We'll say first white line Allah medal Ramadeis. Until the pasuk itself comes actually to teach you like it did by Nazir. Fine. Amar Mar. Ma prat mafurash pri upsolas pri af kol pri upsolas pri. So we'll say, so we said before, remember again, the klal prat of the Rabbanon, that just like ultimately again, the prat includes pri, the fruit, and psoles, pri, the psoles, right? What did I say? What was the word I used before? Not garb, the inferior, thank you. The inferior part of the pri, all right, or the decayed part of the pri, af kol pri psol pri. Says the Gemara, by the way, what does this refer to? Pri, envy. So the pri, of course, refers to grapes. Psoles pri mahi. They will say, what's psoles pri? Chometz. That's the vinegar. Af kol pri mahi. So we'll say, when we say now, the pasuk comes to teach me pri and psoles pri, and the drasha comes to teach me every other fruit. So we'll say, once you have grapes and once you have vinegar, that they're both permitted to a Nazir, what else are you coming to include? So it's very interesting. Gur haki. So we'll say, what's gur haki? So gur haki, I will say, the Rush points out, are grapes that have not matured. Grapes that are not matured. Gur haki. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa, that's included as well. That halacha l'maisa, those are prohibited to the Nazir as well. Af kol de psoles pri mahi. So we'll say, ultimately again, so when it says even every other form of inferior pri, what is that coming to include? Mahi, amrav kahana, la suye. Now, by the way, when we say grapes that when we say grapes that halacha l'maisa haven't been harvested, what it also means, meaning immature grapes. Immature, you know those grapes that just can't get their act together, right? So the immature, in other words, they haven't been harvested. They're on the tree. They're immature grapes. So those are also included in the prohibition of Nazir. So the Gemara says, Rav Kahana says it also comes to include something else. La suye invi dichrin, wormy grapes. Wormy grapes, right? In other words, worm-infested grapes. So I will say, even if a Nazir were to eat those, halacha l'maisa, he would be chayiv for violation of his Naziros. The ad zag, when we say that again, remember it comes to include the grape skins up until the grape seeds. Amravina la suye de bein habeinaim. So I will say, interesting, what's bein habeinaim? So this is actually very interesting. These are grapes, I will say, you see this sometimes on a cluster of grapes, where you could have some smaller grapes that are nestled inside the cluster. So often what ends up happening is these grapes don't develop like the others, right? Why? Because again, since they're on the inside of the cluster, they don't get the same sunlight. So we'll say, so again, the Gemara is suggesting that Joshua would tell us, even those type of underdeveloped, inner cluster grapes are also, if a Nazir eats them, he's also going to be higher for those. The Adzag, Ima Prat Mufurash Prigamar, I've called pre-gummer. So I'll say, maybe we should say it's just like the prat. Just like the prat. So I'll say, if you look at it, both the Rush and Rashi, if you look at the Rush, it's the last Rush on the page, Bein HaBeinayim, Perisha Beinotam, Anavim Kitanim Sha'omdim Bein HaGdolim. These are the small grapes that are nestled there in the middle between the larger grapes. He says, Ve'inam Ru'uyim La'achila. They're not fit for consumption. Ultimately, again, I will say, so because they're nestled inside of the cluster, ultimately, again, they don't get to see the sun, and therefore they don't. I will say, if you think about it, I know I found this imagery very striking. It's sometimes like a good metaphor for family dynamics as well. You have a family, you have a cluster, and there are some members of the cluster, that are assertive, that are great, they're all doing fine, they're getting the necessary sunlight, the necessary attention. And then what happens? Sometimes you have the members of the family that are kind of pushed between the other grapes, right? In other words, they're there, and they're part of the cluster, but they're never really on the exterior. They're always just on the interior. And I would say it's so important in family dynamics to be attentive to the smaller grapes, because the smaller grapes are never going to push themselves out to the front, right? The smaller grapes are never going to go ahead and clamor for the spotlight, and the smaller grapes sometimes won't even necessarily tell you when something is wrong. Sometimes what just ends up happening with the smaller grapes in the family dynamic is they kind of just recede to the interior a little bit. But what ends up happening is overall, right, and over time, their growth is stunted, right? Because they don't get the same attention. They don't get the same love. They don't get the same sun as everyone else. And so you have to be, in a family, you have to be attentive to your cluster to make sure that every single grape is getting exactly what it needs in order to fully self-actualize and mature in a healthy way. All from a ribuy namiyut. Incredible. So let's go weiter. Let's finish this up. Says the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Ad Zag Amar Avina Lasui Divin Abena. Fine. Amar Mar, Ima Prat Mafurash Pre-Gummer, Afkol Pre-Gummer. So we'll say, so we said before, just like the Prat refers to a pre-gummer, so to every pre-gummer. So the Gemara says, Amrit Imkain, Maniach HaKasaba Mashmo Shalo Amru. So we'll say, if that's the case, then what is it that's being taught to us that the pasuk itself did not already convey? To which the Gemara says, Shalo Amru Anavim. So the Gemara says, Shalo Amru Anavim Lachim Yiveshim Aksivi. Pasuk already says, right, fresh grapes, dry grapes. Yain v'chometz, wine and vinegar. Pasuk says, Ha'in alecha ladun kilashon achron ele kilashon rishon. Rather, Rabbi say, what it tells you is you cannot go with the last lashon, rather you have to go with the early lashon, namely that it's not referring to pre-gummer, rather it's referring to pre-stam. And what's the case there? So we'll say if we're going to include everything as a result of the drasha, then ultimately, again, what is the exegetical principle helping us learn? What is it coming to teach us when it adds in the phrase anytime generally you find the prat uklal, so we'll say in general, you don't darshan everything through the lens of the prat. Ella nase mosaf ala prat ad yifrat lacha kasav. Rather, I will say what it says is that Allah in general, when you have a prat to klal, I will say, so ultimately we do not look at the principle through the lens of the prat. Rather, ultimately, again, we see the klal as adding on to the prat ad yifrat lacha kasav top of lamed hey. Kederach shaparat lecha ben Nazir. But I will say ultimately again until unless of course you have a specific exception, as we happen to have in the case of Nazir. So I will say what we are left with effectively in this case I will say is what is halacha l'maisa. Remember, let's just not lose track of where we were. Right? What do we have? We have a Mishnah teaching us that halacha l'maisa Nazir is usher in 4 things. What are the 4 things? Number one. Tuma. Number 2, 3 things. Number 2, taglachas. Number 3, remember again, the lashon over here was hayotze min hagefen. Mishnah then went on to say, what is yotze min hagefen? What does that refer to? Number 1, grapes. Number 2, grape skins. Number 3, grape seeds. Number 4, wine. What does the Gemara infer from our Mishnah? What's not included in the prohibition of the Nazir? What's not included? Leaves and shoots. Rejecting the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, to which the Gemara says, this is machlokes. Rabbi Elazar says, Nazir can't eat leaves and shoots. Chachamim say they can. What's the basis of machlokes? It's an exegetical machlokes, right? Rabbi Elazar darshans ribui and miut. The Rabbanon are darshaning ultimately again a klal or prat, or really a prat uklal. And I will say all we're doing is going through again the actual drashas which we did, and then again after that we got into this discussion. We're branching out in that discussion as well. So I will say we have not resolved this machlokes. We know what our Mishnah holds, but we do not know yet what the halacha l'mais is. We'll stop over here for today, and the minister will say, let's do a few minutes of Mesilas Yesharim together. So I will say we have the incredible source. First of all, we are entering into the last week of Mesilas Yesharim. I will say, pretty incredible, no? Pretty incredible. In the Meretz Hashem, a week from tomorrow is our last shir on Mesilas Yesharim. Stay tuned for coming attractions in the Meretz Hashem. But I will say this is our last parak. Parak Chavav. Last chapter 26. Last parak of Mesilas Yesharim. So I'll say, here we go. Right, Ramchal Bebeir Midas HaKidusha. Where do we stop here today? Just see where we stop. The Hime Haish. Good. So I'll say, let's go. So remember again, in this chapter, the Ramchal writes, Beber Midas HaKidusha, an explanation of the Midah of Kidusha. So look at the Ramchal. So we'll say, this is absolutely incredible. Iyuna Kidusha Kafalu. The Ramchal writes, Kidusha is a twofold endeavor. Watch this. He says, Dainu tchilasa avoda v'sofa gmul. The beginning part of Kidusha Bosa is avoda, means you have to put in effort. And the last part, the gmul. Now, Bosa, what does gmul mean? Gmul, like gemilos chasadim. Gmul means something that someone else gives you. Isn't this fascinating? So Kidusha is acquired in a 2-stage process. First, there's the work that you do, and then there's that which is done for your boss, right? It's amazing. We just spoke about this in yesterday's drasha, right? The concept of being a taker, right? Sometimes you have to take. Sometimes you have to take. So that it's incredible. I'll say, by the way, I find it amazing, just in general, how every single thing we learn, it's everything. Maybe I just only share. I haven't found the tinus michas chaver, right? But every other thing, literally, that we learn, the Ramchal is always talking about the same thing that day. It's absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. I give a share to a group of 11th graders, and we're learning Ramchal as well. We do a lot of things, learning Ramchal. And the big joke is, because every single thing we learn, like, okay, Rabbi, we know everything is from the Ramchal. Everything is from the Ramchal. I feel like I'm talking to my kids. Right? It's great. It's Baruch Hashem. So also listen to this. So he says, two parts to Kedusha. Number one is what you do. Number two is what is bestowed upon you. Tchilaso ishtadlus. Here it is. The first part of Kedusha Bosa is your ishtadlus. You putting in the effort. V'sofo matana. And the second part of Bosa, of the acquisition of Kedusha, is a matana. But say matana from who? Matana from who? From the Ribbon Hashem. Watch this. V'hainu shetchilasahu masha adam mekadesh atzmo. Rabbi say the first step of kedusha is how a person has to be mekadesh himself, and we'll discuss what that means. I have to sanctify myself. V'sopo masha mekachim also. And Rabbi say, in the merit of what I do for myself, Hakadosh Baruch Hu then confers kedusha upon me as well. So there's earned kedusha. That's the effort I put in. That's the ishtadlus. And as a result of my hishtadlus, there's conferred kedusha. Hakadosh Baruch Hu places kedusha upon me. Adam mekadesh atzmo ma'at. A person sanctifies himself a little bit. Mekachim osa harbe. Ultimately, again, the Ribbon Shalom sanctifies him much. Milamata, I sanctify myself here in this world. Mekachim osa milamala. Hakadosh Baruch Hu sanctifies me from above. So this is the dialectic of kedusha. There's the effort I put in this world. There's the effort I put in. And then ultimately, again, after I put in my effort, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives me Kedusha as well. Here we go. So I will say, let's first start with our Hishtadlus. I will say, what is the Hishtadlus, the effort I have to put in order to become a holy person? So it says, Hishtadlusu, She'adam nivdal v'ne'atak min ha'chomrius legamrei. So I will say, person has to separate himself from materialism. And I connect myself to divinity, to elukius, to godliness whenever possible. Now what does this mean? So once again, the Ramchal's been our Rebbe for a long time now. So we know that Ramchal is never preaching asceticism, right? He's not preaching an unrealistic lifestyle. What he is trying to tell us, Rabbi say, is that often my material life and my spiritual life are at odds. That's just a fact. Right? And often what ends up happening is my quest for materialism so derails my quest for spirituality. Often that's just real. So therefore, and that's just the way that it is. That's it, Rabbi say, I want to point out, that's not something that's wrong with us. That's how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us, right? That tension was created by the Ribbono Shel Olam himself. My goal, what's my job in life? My job in life is to address this tension and find the right balance. But in order to find the right balance, I have to ask myself, what are the parts of my material life that are derailing me, and how do I offload them? That's it. I mean, not that's it. In other words, that's it, but then that becomes a lifetime quest. The Aldavar Zen Nikru Nevi'im Malachim. Ki Yishar Ba'aron, Ki Sifsei Koin Yishmaru Das, V'Torah Yivakshu Mipiu, Ki Malach Hashem Sevakoshu. Shabbos says, so again, as the Pasuk says, this is why the Nevi'im are often called prophets. Why are they called prophets? I'm sorry, the Nevi'im are called Malachim. Why are the Nevi'im called Malachim, Rabbi say? Because often, again, what does it mean? What is the one thing a Malach doesn't need? What doesn't a Malach need? A Malach doesn't need anything material. So therefore, often the Nevi'im who reach an elevated spiritual status are often called malachim, because what they've been able to do is they've been able to go ahead and offload the unnecessary materials. Closest passage from Malachi, the lips of a coin yishmeru das. They guard and they guard wisdom. Ultimately, again, Torah is requested from his mouth. This pasuk, my family put this pasuk on my grandfather's Zichrono Livracha is Matseva. My grandfather was a Kohen. And her father was a Kohen, so this is the pasuk that's on his matzeva. The idea that who's the Malach Hashem Tzavakos? Who's the Kohen? The Kohen is the person ultimately again who's able to realize there's this constant tension between Olam Hazeh, Olam Haba, constant tension between Ruchnius and Gashmius. Can I avoid all Gashmius? Of course not. I will say I'm not supposed to. Can I enjoy a good slice of Gashmius in this world? Absolutely. But like everything else, enjoy it responsibly and make sure that that enjoyment is not derailing your spiritual development. He goes on, and I will say a true Kaddish realizes that even in those times when I'm enjoying Gashmius, I can't allow the Gashmius to derail my connection with Hashem. So what's the Simcha goes on. And I will say, just to understand, it's so easy to read these words, but what he's describing over here, this hands down is the greatest struggle in life. This is it. This is it. Being able to figure out, I want to literally have my cake and eat it too. I want to enjoy Gashmius, but yet not allow Gashmius to derail Ruchnius. I will say, and this is the greatest struggle in life. So the tzaddikim amongst us are able to live Gashmi lives, but even during their Gashmius doesn't derail their Ruchnius. This is v'amnam. Lefishi asher la'adam shiasimu al atzmo matzavazeh. Therefore, I will say, it's not really possible for most of us to give up. Now, the real tzaddikim, what the real tzaddikim knows is what? They give up all Gashmius for the sake of Ruchnius. So Ramchal says, that's not us. That's not us. He says, Ki kavidu mimenu. That's a heavy lift, and that's a bit too much. Ki sof chamri ubasar v'adam. Because well, at the end they were physical material beings. So, in other words, even though I know, are there tzaddikim in this world, Rabbi say, who give up Gashmius for the sake of absolute Ruchnius? Yeah, absolutely. Am I one of those people? No way. And by the way, to be honest, it's all about honest. I'm not even striving to be a person like that. Right? In other words, that's not my goal. My goal, my personal goal, is not to be a person who gives up Gashmi. Right? It's not realistic for me. I'm not giving up Gashmius. It's not happening now, and it's not even part of the grand life plan. Right? Even if the genie was in the bottle, so you could be whatever you want, do whatever you want, that wouldn't be a wish. That wouldn't be. The Ramchal says that's okay. That's not us. That's not us. That's an elevated level, but that's not us. He says, "Kisof sof chamri ubasar v'dam al kinamarti shesof hakidush matana." Oh. Now I understand the dialectic. See, I will say, here's what it is. Here's what it is. You see, what's the real hishtadlus by Kedusha? What's the real hishtadlus? The real hishtadlus is you give up as much Gashmius as you can. See, I will say, but the reality is, for most of us, that's not realistic. That's not realistic. I am a physical being, and I enjoy my Gashmius. I got it. I have to enjoy it responsibly. I have to enjoy it in moderation, and I have to enjoy it in a way that it doesn't stare, it doesn't undermine the ruchnius I want to accomplish. But that's where I'm holding. Now the Ramchal says, now you understand. That's why, what's my job? My job is put in the effort. Put in the effort. The effort in accordance with where I'm holding in life. And I will say, that's why, that's the first part of acquiring Kedusha. And what's the second part? What's the second part? What's the second part? A matana, a gift from Hashem. You see, I will say, because given the fact that I am a Gashmi being, I'm not going to reach the full level of Kedusha on my own. So therefore, I'm going to put in my effort. But the second part of the acquisition of Kedusha is a gift from above, a gift from Hashem. He goes on, he says, Kimashi yuchala adam lasos, hu eshtalas harishona, beredifas hayidiyah ha'amitis, v'asmadas ha'askala b'kedusha ha'maisa. See, I will say, my job, my hishtadlus, ultimately, again, is to reinforce, right? Is to reinforce this hasmada, to reinforce this mindset, right? To reinforce all the different things also that we've been speaking about up until now. Redifa ideas amitis, run after true understanding of Kedusha, as we learned before, reinforce the concept of Kedusha over and over, try to sanctify my actions, and don't get derailed by materialism. Achasofu, shakolish baruch hu yadjiche b'derech hazeh, Shuchafes laleches ba v'yashra alav kidushasa v'kacheu. But I will say, at the end of the day, I cannot do it on my own. I need HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help me. Va'az yitzlach biyado ze hadavar, sheyuchal lios b'dveikos hazeh imo yisparach b'timidos. So Shabbos say, listen to this synergistic partnership. So if I put in my effort, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu blesses me with additional siyata d'shmaya, that's how Kedusha is acquired. That's how great things happen. So you know what we'll do? We'll stop over here for today. We're stopping a little bit earlier than the allotted time, but we'll be fine for tomorrow minutes. But again, we are introduced now, says Ramchal, to this incredible, beautiful, magnificent, synergistic partnership between man and God in the acquisition of Kedusha. I do my part, which is establishing the right mindset. I do my part in making sure that I try to establish a healthy balance between materialism and spirituality. I do my part in making sure that my materialism does not derail my ruchnius, but there's only so far I am going to get as a basar v'dam. But after I do my part, here's the incredible news. We'll say, what's the incredible news? After I do my part, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does his part, and he gifts me incredible Kiddush. We'll say, rest to be continuing tomorrow. Shkoyach. Good morning.
This concept by the Meister became that.